First, we have with Caroline, our colleague and our research assistant, a presentation on the impact of the revolution on the political participation of the queer community, followed by a documentary on same topic. And after, we'll be receiving from you guys like questions, and we try to answer them. After this, we will have like another presentation with our colleague also, Henry, on the impact of the Syrian Civil War and displacement on diverse SOGIES population, and also it will be followed by a documentary concerning the same topic. And we'll have also like another Q&A small session together. Please note that the convention will be recorded, and we will be glad taking the questions in the chat box. And now I'm happy to introduce Caroline again. Caroline, she's our research assistant on masculinity and sexuality stream.
Hello everyone, good morning. I'm Caroline. I will be presenting a brief PowerPoint on our first documentary on the impact of Lebanese revolution on the queer community. So to start with, So starting with the PowerPoint, please next, Becca. It's important to mention that the Lebanese revolution, it's embarked on October 17, 2019, where different protesters from different areas embarked in the streets due to different corruption and levels, and due to and due to political corruption, due to increased WhatsApp taxes and tobacco taxes. This led to the designation of the Prime Minister back then, aiming for and echoing for the protesters in order to demand for an independent political parties in the parliament. So next, please, Becca. So to start with, this movement were of much organization through the queer community. So individuals from the queer community were organizing peaceful protests. Please next, Becca. Thank you. Peaceful protests weeks before the revolution started. So throughout the revolution, at first, different queer communities, they interacted together through different networks in order to demand others to join this protest. As we will see in the documentary, that the queer community participating in the revolution or the Thawra, they protested for their basic rights like water, like electricity, and different things despite their gender identity. Next, please, Becca. Okay, as for this graffiti, the before this one. The graffiti before. This graffiti showed the fight against homophobia / hate / racism and sexism. This was put on the Egg Theater that used to be the main theater in Lebanon. As for the individuals and the progress of the revolution among individuals of the queer community, they started since day one, and this will be mentioned in the documentary, to group themselves and to demand for the freedom of right. At first and at the beginning of the revolution or the Thawra was a safe space for the members of the queer community in terms of protection from harassment and being in a more or widened social network that was not privileged for them before. For that, they believed that this would lead a change at the level of our community, where it helped people to connect with different people from different age group, especially the older group of a queer community. And we will be as well seeing that throughout the documentary. It was a first for the queer community to be present on the streets, protesting, chanting different chantings related to queer community and holding the rainbow flag, and it was a lot of visible for them. It was a breakthrough. It gave hope that we will have a place in order to be and create our safe spaces in the Lebanese community. Next backup, please. Okay, as we see this graffiti, this wall is named the shame wall, where everything would be written on this wall against the parliament and the political parties in charge and in power. So here we can see Malak Harris, who kicked an armed minister bodyguard who were going to shoot someone. So it was an iconic figure and the symbol for the Lebanese revolution. Next, please. So, as we said at the beginning, the revolution was a safe space, or the society found on the streets, protesting and chanting different chantings with a queer community. After days from the revolution, the fifth column broke through the revolution, and queer community started to feel more abused and not accepted within the environment. The abuse level was increasing day by day, which we would see in the documentary. Physical abuse, verbal abuse, due to different systems of beliefs. And what we mean by the fifth column is that the political parties started to joining or aggressively attacking the protesters. So mainly due to the physical appearance of the queer community, they were also based on their identity subject to physical violence. And this didn't stop here. Even they experienced physical and verbal violence from security forces, and it will be mentioned in the documentary as well. Next, please. As for this graffiti, it mentions that Lgbtiq is not a curse word, which is queer is not a curse word. During chanting against one of the parliament members, they said a lot of chanting regarding Lgbtiq is not a curse word. So we did some awareness, like we see on this graffiti, for people to know that this is humiliating for us as a queer community, and they were actually sensitized on that, and they were referring to other people. No, we need to change this. This isn't a curse. So that was really inspiring. Next, please. Next, okay. As for the post-revolution, unfortunately, due to political agendas and several attacks to the queer community, where they were the lead in the Thawra or revolution, and due to COVID pandemic, the revolution stopped. There are some planning for reassuming the Thawra or the revolution after maybe the COVID, even though the queer community has managed to improve its organization and networking and visibility among different members in the society, but still we have so much to achieve related to things related to basic civil rights, relying on some future resistance and the protests that might be done in the future. So we will be seeing more detailed examples from activists on that were participating in protests in the Thawra. So we'll be seeing afterwards the documentary. Next, please, Becca. Okay. As for this, we wanted to a bit highlight the impact of Beirut explosion on the queer community. This as well will be mentioned in our first documentary. Since Jumayzi area, this footage is in Jumayzi area, is the safe space and it's the main place where queer community resides in Beirut. So this area that will be mentioned as safe space in the documentary was totally destroyed, and these safe spaces are not right now available. So we can now start with the documentary, and if you have any questions, please place them in the chat box. And thank you. Becca, please.
أول نهار بالثورة كان عنا كويز نايت، عاملين مثل لعبة بكوبراتيف أنا ضمنها، وهي كوبراتيف تهتم بشؤون النساء ونحكي عن هدول المواضيع أكتر. بلشوا يحكوا خلال النهار إنه إيه يلا ننزل. ما كتير أخذنا وعطينا، لأن كان إلنا أصلاً فترة يعني كل أسبوع أو كل أسبوعين عم نعمل مسيرة كان بخصوص حق العمل، قانون العمل بلبنان، وإن كان لغير أسباب. فما كتير أخذنا وعطينا وكنا شوي تعبانين إذا بتذكر منيح. رجعنا على البيت، شفنا الصور، شفنا الفيديوهات، وما قدرنا نبقى بالبيت. دغري حكينا بعض مثل ما نحنا كنا لابسين يعني ثياب سهرة، بعد منا لابسين قعوبة، كملنا دغري على الشارع. وكان شي خيالي، ما كان حدا متوقع يصير اللي بده يصير. طلعينا من الساحة. ما كنا عم نلحق نغسل، كنت ارجع على البيت ما في مي، عصب ارجع انزل على الساحة. يعني بتذكر نهار بالتحديد طافت علي، رجعت على البيت مبهدلة وبدي البس، بدي غير تيابي، بتحاول غير تيابي بسرعة احسن ما انضر. ما في مي او ما كان في كهرباء كرمال اعلي الاذان. فعصبت انه إنه كان شيء ما عم بقدر استوعبه. هلا ما في لاقي لك الكلمات للشعور المستفز، إنه ما عم نحكي هلا عم نحكي بالموضوع. ما كنت عم فكر أبدا بلبسي أو بهويتي، أنا نازلة لأن بتعرض لأشياء من وراء هويتي الكويرية طبعا، بس كمان نازلة لأشياء بعد بديهة أكتر من هيك، اللي هي ماي، طبابة، كهرباء، حقوق بعد بديهة أكتر من حقي إنه أكون مع شخص بحبه، أو حقي أكون عم أكون نفسي. قبل هيك حقي أكون إنسان ما كان موجود.
أنا كنت نازلة لحالي actually، بس رفقاتي اللي كانوا معي كلهم كانوا كوير أو ترانس أو إلى ما هنالك، يعني من الكوميونيتي. كمشهد كنا واضحين زيادة بالنسبة للعالم.
بدي كمان أطالب بحقوقي أنا كمان كامرأة، بدي طالب بحقوقي كإنسانة عابرة، بدي طالب بحقوقي كإنسانة بايسكشوال، مش بس كمان كقصص اللي أنا بدي إياها إنه كمواطنة عادية، مش بس الأكل والشرب، كمان في حقوق تاني كمان لازم أحصل عليها، اللي هي إنه أنا بكون عندي الحرية إنه أعبر عن حالي، يكون عندي الحرية إنه أنا أتعامل مثل أي حدا تاني بهذا المجتمع. فهيدي واحدة من الأسباب الأساسية إنه نزلت لشارك بهذه الثورة، لأنه بحس إنه نحن إذا نزلنا وكلياتنا شاركنا وصوتنا كان موجود، حنقدر نعمل شيء، حنقدر نعمل تغيير بعدين.
مجرد الوجود كان مشاركة كتير فعالة، يعني مجرد وجود هيك أنماط من العالم تعتبرها شيء جدا غريب أو غير مرحب فيه أو إلى ما هنالك، كان مشاركة بحد ذاته، من تلقي الأسئلة والرد على الأسئلة اللي كانت عم تطرح علينا.
يعني كنت حاسة إنه بالمحيط اللي أنا كنت موجودة فيه على القليل كنت حاسة يعني خصوصا خلال أول يوم. هلا بعدين لاحقا لما بلش إنه يفوتوا ناس من برا، لما بلش يفوتوا الناس اللي تابعين للأنظمة تاعيتهم، هول الناس اللي كنت عم حس منهم إنه حصل معي تحرش منها على أساسه، بس مش من الناس المتظاهرين، من الناس اللي كانوا جايين من برا. بالمبدأ كمان يعني الجروب اللي كان موجود محاوطني أمن لي الحماية، ساعدني إنه ما حدا يقرب صوتي. حتى كنا عاملين كمان مع حلب، كان في مثل خيمة عاملينها للLGBT المجتمع اللي معي، كنا كاتبين عليها بالرينبو، وكلنا يعني كذبنا وبشكل مبهم، بس كل شخص ينتمي إلى مجتمع اللي معي كان عم يشوفها كان عم بيفهم انه انه هذه خيمه لنا. فكنا عاملينها هيدي انه مثل مجال للعالم في حال صار معهم تحرش، في حال تعرضوا لاي شيء، كانوا انه بيقدروا يجوا لعنا ونقدر نساعدهم كلنا ونعمل لهم سبورت، او في حال حدا عم بيزعجهم بنروح من نواجه هذا الشخص انه انت عم تزعج. وهذا الشيء اللي صار.
كنا نتعرف على عالم جديده تحت من الكوميونتي، دائما نكون عم بمحطات معينه واقفين. انا جربت ما اكون مركزه بمطرح معين، انه ضلنا عم نفوت بكل الاجواء، لانه كلهم صاروا يدبوا جروبات. جربت حاول ضلني موجوده بكل جروب حتى، بس اوكي كان شوي ما بعرف شو كنت عم بعمل بالضبط، بس كنت بدي اكد فكره انه نحن نفس الشيء، وانه العالم اول ما تشوفني يمكن ما تعرف انه هيدا من الكوميونتي، بس بعدين بس نصير ناخذ ونعطي يعرفوا انه اوكي ما نكون بعاد عنا، ما نكون غربة، نحن نفس الشيء مش مختلفين عن بعض. هذا الشيء اللي كنت حاول وصله. اكيد في عالم من رفقاتي تعرضوا لإساءات تحت بسبب شكلهم، يعني
وجودي بهذه الثورة، وجود إنه هذا الكم الهائل يعني من المجتمع الميم عين موجود بهذه الفعالية، موجود بهذا الحماس، بهذا المومنتم الموجود اللي كان موجود عليه بوقتها، عطاني يعني دافع كبير لقدام، عطاني حافز كبير لقدام إنه لسه في مجال نعمل شيء، لسه في مجال إنه كلمتنا تكون مسموعة، لسه في مجال إنه نعمل وجود لنا بهذا المجتمع. ممكن مش هلا بهذه اللحظه، بس انه في البذره موجوده، ولازم نضلنا عم نشتغل، ولازم انه ما نخلي هذا الشيء يوقف ابدا.
يعني انا اللي كنت قارنه انه عاده العالم لما اكون ماشي على الطريق ويسالوني انت شاب ولا بنت بطريقه المسخره والمحاوله الاساءه بقدر القطه، كان السؤال مختلف كليا تحت. يعني العالم اللي تحت بالمظاهرات كانت عم تسالني انت شاب ولا بنت، كانت بطريقه استفسار اكثر، انه مستغربين يعني بدهم يعرفوا. سو انا الشيء الطبيعي اللي كنت لهم انه مثلا ولا وحده او الاثنين سوا، او بلش اسال، يصيروا يسالوا اكثر وانا اصير جاوب اكثر. فايه كثير مرق قدامي مواقف انه كانوا مهتمين يعرفوا انه انتوا شو وليه بتضلكم مجمعين مع بعض وعشو عم بتطالبوا وليه مطالبكم غير مطالبنا. وهون بيجي دوري انه نصح هيدي الافكار انه لا نحن مطالبنا مش مختلفه.
كان في أوقات إنه وين كانوا الأشخاص يعاملوني كرجل، وبهذا الشيء كان شوي بخوف، لأن كان في العنف يلي بتشوفه بين رجل ورجل يلي عادة بمجتمعنا منه موجود تجاه مرأة، لأن المرأة ما بتضربها أو مرأة ما بتتعرض لها بنفس الطريقة. فكان شوي مفاجئ لي، يعني نوع من العنف أنا مني مواجهته قبل، ما بعرف أتعامل معه قبل. بنفس الوقت إجا معه privileges معينة، وإن حسيت حالي شوي أكتر بأمان من ناحية جنسية يمكن.
أي كلب منكم لعشني من شعري، أي كلب فو على الدولة، فو كلاب مش لحظة ما بحقلكم
في عنف من الدولة، في عنف من الطريقة اللي بيطلع فيك، يعني العنف اللي بتشوفه عنف مع رجل كان واضح من الأشخاص يلي بالقوى الأمن أو هيك، يعني في هيدا شو أنت أو فيلم الوجه، يعني إذا شايف امرأة ما بظن كان بعملها نفس الطريقة، كان في عنف معين من هدول الأشخاص.
يلا سوريا بيروت، يلا سوريا بيروت، ويا لبناني ويا مسكين وضحكوا عليكي اسم الدين، ويلا سوريا بيروت، يلا سوريا بيروت، مسكين ومش مسكين، مش مسكين ومش مسكين، بدنا حقوق المثليين، بدنا حقوق المثليين، ومش طالعين ومش طالعين، مش طالعين ومش طالعين. من هالشارع مش طالعين على الاسود وعلى الاسود على هوموفوبيا في بيروت.
ليك هيدا من أنا وصغيرة كنت، مش أنا صغيرة، من كم سنة لهلأ كنت كتير فكر إنه وينن الأشخاص من هيدا العمر معين، من فئة عمر معين، وما كنت أعرف وين. وكان حتى مثل discussion أنا ورفقاتي، أنا وشخصين ثلاثة، إنه وينن الكوير وومن من هيدا فئة العمر، وينن ما بنشوفهم بالمرمخايل، ما بنشوفهم بالجميزة، ما بنشوفهم بالمساحات اللي عادة هي آمنة إلنا بحد معين. هلأ ما بعرف وينن، بس بعرف إنه شفتهم بالثورة وحبيت إنه شفتهم بالثورة. حسيت إنه يمكن قبل ما كنت شايفة إنه عندي مصير بلبنان، عندي future in Lebanon، لأن ما كنت شوف هالأشخاص يلي هن أكبر مني ما بعرف بالأربعينات خمسينات، هيدا الage range، تحس إنه ما هم موجودين. حس حالي إنه مش حس حالي، بس إنه حس أنا والجيل اللي شوي أكبر مني ما في غيرنا، ما في قبلنا، أو يلي قبلنا يا فلوا يا جوزوا أو هن تجوزوا. يعني أقصد إنه خلص إنه you need to live a certain way to survive in a country like this. كمان يجيك حقوق معينة، كمان ما تنتسى من دولة ما عندها حماية لأشخاص مسنين وغيره وغيره. ف it was nice to see them, to know they exist here. It was very comforting. Yeah. Yeah.
يعني لأنه حسيت إنه فعلياً نحن إنه ننتمي لهذا المجتمع، فعلياً نحن إنه بفترة من الفترات كنا جزء لا يتجزأ من هذا المجتمع، والعالم كانوا حاسين فينا ونحن كنا حاسين بالعالم. فكنت كتير مبسوطة. يعني واحدة من الشغلات اللي صارت خصوصاً أول يومين إنه كانوا عم يطالبوا إنه النسوان يكونوا على الخطوط الأمامية. فأنا ما كان معي خبر. أول شيء كنت عم بتظاهر عادي، بينط لي حدا بيقولوا لي إنه بليز النسوان ينزلوا على الخطوط الأمامية، نطلب منكم. فحملت حالي ونزلت، لقيت شي 4-5 خطوط كلاتهم نساء، في ناس بعرفهم ناس ما بعرفهم، ناس من مختلف الباك جراوندز، من مختلف الخلفيات، ناس محجبين ناس مش محجبين، وكوكتيل مميز من نساء من جميع أطياف المجتمع، ومن ضمنهم امرأة عابرة بالنص قاعدة كمان عم تهتف مع بهذه اللحظة طلعت هيك إنه واو، انبسطت إنه أوكي، إنه أنا كوني أنا كامرأة، ودايما إنه بحكي عن حالي إنه كنا عم نحارب بالأساس من أول إنه أنا كرمال إنه أوصل لأنه لأنه يعترف فيني المجتمع كامرأة. بهذه اللحظات حسيت حالي إنه فعلا المجتمع اعترف فيني، إنه فعلا أنا وعد، يعني مثل ما أنا مفكرة حالي، مثل الصورة اللي أنا شايفتها بالنسبة لحالي المجتمع كمان شايفها بنفس الوقت.
وبعتقد إنه لما حسينا بهذا الشعور بالأمان فهمناه للشعور، وبعتقد إنه صار أوضح لنا كيف نوصل له نرجع. بس هل نحن رح نسلك هذا الطريق ولا لا؟ ما بعرف. ككوميونيتي إنه هل رح نرجع دايما نكون مجتمعين وما نشتغل على نفس الأساس؟ ما بعرف، تعتمد مجهود شخصي بحس من كل حدا.
ما بظن الثورة قدرت تعمل كثير أشياء لهلأ، لأن وقفت بطريقة نون أورجانيك. وين ما وقفت هي وقف العالم. فلهلأ أنا ما في أقول إنه شفت كثير أشياء تغيرت. يمكن شفت تنظيمنا عم يتحسن شوي أكتر، بس رجع نام من بعد الكوفيد، بس راجعين وبعد في شغل كتير، وإن شاء الله لوقتها يكون رجعنا شوية حياة من بعد انفجار ومن بعد موت بطيء. ترجعنا الحياة تنرجع نقاوم بالطريقة اللي كنا عم نقاوم فيها. So وما بتذكر شو سألتك قبل ما أجي، يعني سألتك بس جيت إنه do you think there was an impact؟ ما بظن كان في impact. Again, if anything changed is that we were a bit more seen than we usually are، لأن إحنا مش عم نتخبى، بس عم نكون موجودين بأماكننا الآمنة، وساعدت إنه نزلنا مثل ما نحنا على الساحة وشافونا العالم. كنا شوية قائدات أو قائدين أو قائدنا كنا شوية leaders in what happened, mostly because we've kind of always been, but maybe not on this scale. بس نفس الوجوه يلي كنت فيها، يلي كنت شوفها، يعني وجوه تشبهني، وجوه بشوفها بغير مظاهرات، بشوفها بكل مظاهرة actually. إن شاء الله يكون الغير يلي بحاجة يشوفنا شافنا، كرمال يعرف إنه فيه يجي ينضم ويحكي معنا وإحنا موجودين. ومثل ما أنا شفت الأكبر مني لأول مرة الشخص يشوفنا نحنا يمكن لأول مرة ويحس بنفس الهوب.
كل الصور برا اليوم.
Hello. I'm really glad to share this with you guys, and thank you for your amazing comments. A little bit emotional right now. Anyway, let's go through our first question. So Samir was asking Caroline, what do you think about if the revolution changed anything concerning the discourse in Lebanon, or the same situation like before, or it created more limitation? So he was wondering about this. Hopefully, this documentary will answer a little bit this question, but really we would love to hear from you also. Thank you.
Thank you, Herbil, and thank you, Samir, for the question. Actually, the impact, as mentioned even in the documentary, it imposes some minimal impact or minimal challenges on the visibility and on the chantings and the acceptance of the society that were protesting in the revolution. Yet it didn't impact any limitations on them. The only thing is that as mentioned, the non-organic sub of the revolution, but I think it will continue after the pandemic and the current crises in Lebanon. The protests will continue, and things will be more organized as per the upcoming year. And thank you.
You're on mute, Shabab.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying that if you have more questions, we can also, okay. So, Neelam is asking, how does this documentary contribute to the building of consolidated knowledge about the community, and how do you think, Caroline, this could be a value to others?
Actually, the exposure to the queer community, to people, was, if we can say, was very soft. People, they start asking questions, but these questions were somehow nice about, they wanted to know more. They were more sensitized. Different sessions were being conducted, awareness sessions, meetings on this level, different actors from the community, and even newly established political parties were as well found on the streets, even through the awareness sessions conducted in different tents on the field. Actually, what we could sense is the integration of queer community within different organizations, NGOs, INPOs, that now they are even more visible. We are more visible to these actors. They are more integrating the queer community concepts and everything into these organizations. I think this is a breakthrough for now. We will be working more on this with different sectors, different organizations, and that probably will, of course, aid in better understanding and helping towards reaching our rights step by step. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And I would add a little bit, like, actually I see this documentary and as like documenting the history of the queer participation in the revolution, which sometimes it's not acknowledged from a lot also of, like, you know, the general population, etc. Going to Nada, she's asking if any person from the LGBTIQ community arrested and referred to court because they belong to this community. In general, sometimes it happens with, like, LGBTIQ community with non-privileged, like from rural area, etc. Yes, there is, and we have data that we can share with you later. But during the revolution, what happened is, like, if you look different, sometimes the police will try to you know, to use your look against you and to humiliate you in front of everyone just for your look, even if they will not arrest you. So this is concerning what was happening during the protest and the revolution. Evelyn, were there connection between other queer community at this time, either in diaspora and other countries? Evelyn, I didn't get your question.
Hi, I'll abuse my my co-hosting powers to actually speak. No, I was just wondering whether, you know, it was really powerful to see how so many different parts of the queer community in Lebanon were coming together at that time. And I was just wondering whether, you know, you were also talking to other queer communities, either Lebanese community as well, or other queer movements, like how they were organizing, or were there any sort of alliances built in that time, or maybe, you know, that existed before. I was just wondering about that. Thank you.
Caroline?
Okay, sorry. So actually, there were connection within different nationalities, if you want, among the Lebanese. The activists on the streets protesting were also connected, if you want, through organizations, through queer community organizations, to different actors in order to exchange knowledge and experiences. And I think this would be a great experience to be shared among different countries. I'm trying just to follow up on other questions. I don't know, Sabila, if you want to elaborate more.
Because there is another question asking us, like, sorry, but I lost it. Because they're saying, like, it would be hard to reach out to the community during COVID. So many are isolated. Yes, as you see, as you watch in the documentary, we tried also to have, like, meeting on Zoom, and you see in the other documentaries also, because of the travel restriction and the COVID-19 pandemic. But also, not everyone in Lebanon is ready to be out about their sexuality. So it is, like, also, like, that's why we have only, like, 3 interviews, because until now in Lebanon, it's really hard to go publicly and speak without a blurred face in a documentary. But we wanted also only to interview those people because we want this documentary to be powerful for other people to feel a little bit of hope, of safety. So that's why also it's like 3 interviews only, not more than that. So I agree. Thank you, Mazen, for your comment. Alice. Okay. Well, that is Caroline. Do you want to add anything else before?
I just want to add to Alice the question related to international organizations and NGOs. Actually, the funds, if you want to say, directed towards these community interventions are now a bit in place, but they are still minimal. There is no attention toward the current situation, even the Beirut blast, the economical situation or crisis. Different crises and different vulnerabilities are being imposed on different people with different vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities are being less tackled, if we want to say, due to political constraints, due to constraints already in the funds. It's really being a bit sold out, if we can say, but of course it needs more attention to shift more toward emergency settings and response in the meantime.
Thank you, Caroline. Shuman, has taking part in the revolution resulted in more backlash for the community? Has exposure led to more violence? Actually, like during the presence of the queer activists in the revolution and the protest, at first it was really amazing, and then as we mentioned in the documentary and in our presentation, the police people, because they weren't in a police costume. The police people and the infiltrated people, they try to harass based on your look or based on your, and they will actually kind of saying like those people who are leading the revolution, they want us all to be pervert and they want to destroy our families, etc. So yes, at some point, it did backlash on the community, but they still ready to fight it. Like, we feel that it's time for us to be part of whatever political happening in our society and our country, and it's like would not stay away just because we are different. So this is like the whole feeling was during the revolution, and still it didn't end yet. Just COVID now. So, and hopefully we'll be back. Thank you, Shuman, for your question. Thank you all. And now I will be more than happy to introduce Dr. Henry Mertinen, our colleague, and he's the co-investigator on the masculinity and sexuality stream. And hello, Henry. Bye.
Hi, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. I'm joining in from Myanmar, so it's evening here. I'll be talking a bit more about the research that we have done as part of this stream. Sorry. And Evelyn will be sharing the report in the chat, which we just published towards the end of last year. And in this research, wrong button there. So in this research that we've been conducting for the past year and a half approximately, we've been looking at the impacts of the Syrian civil war on persons of diverse SOGIES and LGBTIQ people in Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. And just to give you kind of, because I'll be using these terms a bit interchangeably, and some of you might know them, some might not know them. So SOGIES refers to sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. LGBTIQ plus, different versions of that are being used, refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer, and other sexual orientations and gender identities. So we wanted to look at what the impact of the Syrian civil war has been on persons of diverse SOGIES. And this builds on some of the previous work that Mosaic has been doing together with the LSE as well and other partners. And what we did was then carry out a literature review to see what kind of research has been done already, followed by in-depth interviews in different parts of Lebanon, inside Syria as well, in Aleppo, and in Turkey, in Gaziantep, with Syrian refugees. And in addition to this, then we also had focus group discussions. And in some of the focus group discussions in Lebanon, we also had LGBTIQ people who were Lebanese, some who were Egyptians and Palestinian, and so on, and trying to look at some of the diverse experiences of the LGBTIQ community in Lebanon. So our key research questions were basically looking at what impact the conflicts and the displacement that they cause, as well as the other crises that have been erupting in the region, have had on persons of diverse SOGIES in Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. And we wanted to look at both those who fled Syria, be they Syrian refugees or Syrian Palestinian refugees, and also the host community, the Lebanese LGBTIQ community. Because from our previous research, we had also seen that this influx of Syrian refugees of diverse SOGIES has also created tensions within the Lebanese LGBTIQ plus community. So we started this research in 2019, and over the course of the research then several different other crises erupted. So obviously COVID has played a major role in the research, but also in the lives of our research participants. And in Lebanon, as you saw, there's been a political upheaval, but also a massive economic crisis that's really, really affected people very, very negatively. And also then in Beirut, as you might remember, last August, there was a massive blast in the port. And this is also came up quite a bit in our research interviews as something that really shook people's sense of security. So we wanted to look at what these different dynamics, what kind of impact they've had, and also what some of the key needs and vulnerabilities of persons of diverse SOGIES are, what kind of formal and informal services and networks they can access, and also think through a bit more about how different other factors might be playing a role in addition to sexual orientation and gender identities, looking at age, social class, location, whether they're in a small town or a rural village or in a bigger city, but also then differences between, for example, what does it mean to be a Syrian lesbian refugee compared to a gay refugee, or also really importantly, the appearance factor, the visibility of how visibly someone is seen as being non-heterosexual or non-cisgender. So we have tried to then also really go into a lot more depth with this, and please do feel free to ask more about this after the presentation and read our reports that is being shared with you. So the objective was to document some of these experiences, because this is very much an under-researched field still. In terms of gender, peace and security, in terms of gender and displacement. But also we wanted to go beyond the research and really sort of understand what the needs are, what the survival mechanisms are, how can those be best supported, because Mosaic is not primarily a research organization. We do research, but it's mostly about service provision, and really understanding that much better and making sure that other service providers are able to also give the support that's needed. And for that, we need to understand also better what the barriers might be to accessing services and how to better support informal support networks. And as you saw in the previous video and Caroline's presentation, also recognizing the political participation of the LGBTIQ community of individuals. There is also the risk that in focusing on vulnerabilities and focusing on needs, we forget about the agency of the LGBTIQ community, and we really want to make sure that we don't fall into that trap, and that we really recognize the political activism that is there, and social activism and mutual support that we have found. So to give you a bit of background to Syria and Lebanon in terms of gender relations and impacts of war in Syria and impacts of COVID. So in Syria, gender relations are, as in any country, they differ between different geographical areas and between different ethnic and religious communities, different sects. Some are much more socially conservative than others. There's also quite a big difference there between which armed group is in control of which areas. So, for example, in the Kurdish-controlled areas in the northeast of Syria, you have had experiments with so quite radical democracy and gender equality. In neighboring areas controlled by Islamic State, it's the complete opposite. So there are quite major differences there, and the dynamics have been shifting quite a bit over the course of the war. And conflict and displacement have had a massive impact on gender roles and expectations in Syria. And one thing we do want to understand better is what this means for diverse sexual orientations, gender identities. And we have the preliminary results, but I think it's a bit too early to say in more detail what that impact has been. But it is something that we are going to be looking at more in the future. In Syria, as in Lebanon, there's also the post-colonial legacy. Same-sex relations are prohibited under a French mandate era law. And there is a lot of social conservatism around these issues, but then also sometimes unexpected openings. The war in Syria, that is now in its 11th year now, has seen a lot of different forms of violence being committed against persons of diverse SOGIES by state and non-state armed groups, by the military, by the police, but also various kinds of militia groups, and Islamic State, of course, being the most famous, but also pretty much across the board, there is violence against persons of diverse SOGIES because of their gender identity or sexual expressions. We had reports of sexual extortion, sexual violence, harassment, and threats at checkpoints. And something that came up a lot was that gay and bisexual men and transgender, especially trans women, were often sexually and verbally and physically harassed and abused at checkpoints and elsewhere for being soft-looking. And there's a lot of discussions in the interviews around sort of this need for men to show this hard heterosexual masculinity or otherwise face different forms of threats and violence. In addition to armed actors, there is also then high levels of family and community violence, of so-called honor killings, or family members reporting LGBTI members to militias and threats of discrimination, or being kicked out of the house, losing the right to inheritance, and so on. The war has also led to a shrinking of the safe spaces that existed prior to the war. There weren't that many, but those few ones that were there are no longer safe. And the support networks that were there have also been radically diminished. In terms of the COVID impact, it's a bit difficult to say given sort of the lack of information in general about COVID in Syria. I mean, we know it is there, but the official numbers are very low. There is for a number of reasons, very little reliable statistics on different forms of gender-based violence, domestic violence, and partner violence, but we can assume that that has risen in Syria as elsewhere. And this is a trend that humanitarian actors and especially local women's rights organizations had already noted prior to the pandemic. And this is something that most probably has increased and may also have led to increased violence in families against those family members who are LGBTI or otherwise seen as not living up to gender norms. In Lebanon, in somewhat similar ways, there are quite big differences between different religious groups and classes and locations in terms of gender relations. And Lebanon generally is considered to be one of the relatively more open countries in the region in terms of LGBTI issues, but that doesn't mean that there is complete acceptance, as you've seen in the video. And also in terms of women's rights or women's political participation, Lebanon does lag quite far behind, even by a regional standard. There are, as mentioned, these French mandate era laws in place criminalizing same-sex relationships, even though there have been attempts to overturn those in court. And in terms of everyday life, there is a lot of harassment, marginalization, discrimination against persons of diverse SOGIES, and there's very few legal protections there. But on the positive side, there is much more of an open space for different kinds of NGOs to work on these issues and provide support services compared to, for example, Syria. In Lebanon, what we then saw was, even though there isn't a war, a lot of the people we talked to had fled from a war in Syria and came into a situation where they're then faced with multiple crises. There's a political crisis, economic crisis, COVID-19 happening at the same time, and then the August 4 big port explosion, which, as mentioned, really sort of shook a lot of people to the core. So you have these, what we saw in our interviews a lot was this cumulative impact of these different crises, plus then ongoing homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic discrimination, verbal abuse that a lot of the respondents face, and taking a very, very high psychological toll. And this often then is worse for those who are from poorer socioeconomic classes. There is a lot of also what we unfortunately found also misogyny, homophobia, lesbophobia, transphobia within the LGBTI community. So it's really sort of a wide spectrum of various forms of discrimination, including then, apart from verbal abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse, also extortion and blackmail, discrimination in getting jobs or housing, and sort of a lot of what came up a lot was this feeling that nowhere is safe for a lot of our respondents. In all three contexts, we then, as mentioned, sort of, one of the key things we saw was that the vulnerabilities and the kinds of abuse that people were subjected to often differed with how well they were able to pass, so to say, as heterosexual or as cisgender, and the more visible they were as being of diverse SOGIES, the more harassment, abuse, the more threats, the more risk to their lives, for example, in Syria they had. There was a lot of economic precarity and a really central role for family, friends, and support networks, and then a huge impact where those networks didn't exist or that families were not supportive. Massive emotional and psychological impacts, and then also particular vulnerabilities of trans women that came up, especially because of these sort of hard masculinity norms. But then also these what came up a bit in the video as well, then these microgeographies of security, insecurity of certain parts of town at certain times of day being much more LGBTIQ friendly than at other times, and people then trying to stick to these safe spaces as much as possible. And just to kind of wrap up some of the key findings, so in Syria, there's daily harassment and threats to life of our respondents, a lot of need to adjust their behavior to reduce their visibility. For example, trans women then sort of adopting the hijab and very sort of conservative outfits to blend in with women. There is the danger of disappearance and kidnappings, often kind of instigated by family members, extended family members, fear of detention and disappearance, a lot of lack of support and lack of services, and lack of acceptance, or even when they are displaced in the Syrian refugee communities. In Lebanon and Turkey, similarly, respondents saying that they needed to modify their gender performances in certain locations at certain times. A lot of anxiety because of the multiple crises. But on the positive side, also support from NGOs, support from the UNHCR, and a lot of them also community support for each other. But still, nonetheless, a lot of struggles with family rejection, a lack of privacy, difficulty in maintaining relationships. And economically, a lot of the research participants are extremely precarious, especially because of the economic crisis, and then added to that, the impacts of COVID, especially those who are dependent for survival sex, which tends to be, unfortunately, a lot of the trans women that we were talking to. Moving on with our research into the next phase, we'll pay or continue to pay attention to these intersectional differences, and probably then also diverge a bit between the research questions we're asking in Lebanon and Turkey, where it's more about the unsettledness and looking at the support networks that exist, and also shifting personal gender identities and expressions. Whereas in Syria, it's going to be more about sort of the conflict and post-conflict dynamics, and will be different in different areas of the country, and looking also at these issues of hard masculinity that seem
Hello. Henry? Okay. Can we go for the video, please, and then we can go back for our recommendation from the phase period. Becca? Thank you.
أول شيء نحن الحرب بلشت عنا فيك تقول تسمى بحرب أهلية. يعني أنت ما بتعرف الشخص اللي قدامك، عرفت كيف؟ هو ممكن يكون أكبر أذى بالنسبة له. فهيدا الشيء الحرب الأهلية كتير بشعة، لأنك أنت ما بتعرف مين عدوك. فالحرب خلت عندي خوف دائم، خلت عندي عدم ثقة بأي شخص بأي شيء.
بسوريا من الأساس في حالة من انعدام الأمان والخوف عند أفراد مجتمع الميم، وهذا الشيء أكيد زاد كتير بعد الحرب. صار أفراد مجتمع الميم حتى من بعض يخافوا، صار صعب الناس تلتقى، صاروا حتى إذا في جاي أبليكيشن عم بيكون كتير ناس صعب توثق ببعضها بسبب الحرب. بالإضافة لانتشار المفاهيم المغلوطة إنه مثل إنه الشخص الجاي هو بيحب الأولاد أو بيلحق الأولاد، وهذا الشيء يعني بيخلطوا بين الهوموسيكشواليتي وبين البيدوفيليا.
عدا عن خوف عن حياتك، وانت ما لازم تطلع في اطلاق رصاص وفي قذائف، وعدا الايام اللي انحبسنا فيها بالجامعه، عدا الاشخاص اللي بنحبهم واللي توفوا. كتير. انا حتى قبر امي ما في روح زوره، ما في حط لها ورده، لأنه المنطقة اللي قبر أمي موجود فيها تدمرت، حتى القبر بطل موجود.
كجمعية موزايك عم نبني interventions related ل evidence based studies موجودين، وكمان ليكون عنا resources نكون عم نعطيهم لغير جمعيات يكونوا عم يستفيدوا من شيء علمي لنقدر نبني عليها بعدين policies، لنقدر نبني عليها intervention and response programs. فلهيك نحن قمنا بهيدي الاستدي لأن عن جد نكون موثقين وضع مجتمع الميمعين بمنطقة سوريا، بمنطقة لبنان، وبمنطقة تركيا.
فالشاب السوري لما بيجي لهون بلد مثل لبنان في عدد كتير كبير من السوريين، طبعا دغري وقت اللي بحاول يشتغل أي شيء فحيكون راتبه كتير أقل من أي شخص لبناني، وحيكون في استغلال مثل إنه ساعات عمل زيادة، وممكن ينطلب منه إنه يعمل أشياء خارج العمل، ممكن ينطلب منه إنه وصارت إنه ينطلب منه يروح على بيت رب العمل لحتى يلبي له أحد رغباته الجنسية. وطبعا أي شيء بيحاول يعمله هيدا الشاب حيكون في طرد من الشغل. ففي حوادث للاستغلال الجنسي صارت كتير بلبنان بهذا الموضوع.
من وراء الامبلمنتيشن على الفيلد for several years كنا بنعرف انه هذا الشيء موجود بقلب الكوميونتي، بس ما كان في داتا evidence based لتكون عم تدعمنا بحال نحن ما نقوم اي شيء، تقوم باي intervention based على هود المعلومات. فنحن مشان هيك ظهرنا هيدي المعلومات بطريقه علميه واضحه.
يعني مع انه الفكره هي شوي chaotic، بس بظن انه انا اجتني فرصة احسن بشوي من انه اتعرف على هويتي الجنسية بسوريا. انا ما بقدر اتخيل ابدا كيف كان ممكن اتعامل مع هويتي الجنسية بسوريا غير تركيا. سوريا ما كان عندي انترنت، سوريا ما كان عندي اي حدا يعني ممكن اتواصل معه بشكل انه يفهمني هيك امور. بس كمان لما كنت اول شيء واصل على تركيا، المنطقه اللي كنت عايش فيها والعالم اللي كنت عم بتعرف عليهم كمان ما كانوا متفتحين للقصه، وانا ما كنت متفتح لهويتي الجنسيه. فلما عرفت بهويتي الجنسيه مريت بكره للموضوع.
فبوقتها ما كان عندي غير حل واحد، غير اني اعمل اضطراب هوية جنسية، اللي هو عبر عن حالي بنهار واحد قدام مجتمع كامل، اني اطلع بزي امرأة وروح على مستشفى عسكري. حصلت على اعفاء، انبسطت، خلصت من هالهام وما كنت عارف شو ناطرني. لنهار وقفني حاجز، واكتشف بعد ما ماطل فيه اكتشف شو يعني اضطراب هوية جنسية. ما بقدر اوصف القتل اللي اكلته، لانه يمكن عن جد نصه ماني متذكره، لانه اخر شي بتذكره كيف كانوا الجيش عم بيقول لي اثبت لنا انك هيك. كان أكتر من 7 أشخاص عم بيحاولوا يعملوا شي معي. أهلي وأختي ما كانوا عارفانين إنه أنا عامل اضطراب هوية جنسية على دفتر العلم. فلما أجا سهري وطلعني وفهم شو الموضوع، فخبر أختي وأختي خبرت بيي، والقصة صارت على لسان العائلة كلها. فأنا هون كنت عم بكذب بالحقيقة، بس عن جد كان يعني أنا كل شيء سيء مرقت فيه فيك تقول كان من وراء هذا النهار، لأنه فضحت قدام عائلتي، بلشوا يشكوا فيه عدا الفوبيا اللي صارت عندي. أنا كل ما أشوف حدا لابس عسكري لابس جيشي أنا برتعب. حتى لهلأ هون بلبنان اللي ما خصهم بالجيش السوري أنا برتعب كل ما أشوف جيش.
ممكن مع الوقت إذا انكشف أمرهم يكون في كتير أثر كتير كبير. ممكن ينطردوا من البيت أو ممكن ينقتلوا ويتعرضوا للقتل أو الضرب أو التعذيب، أو حتى ممكن يعتقلوا من قبل السلطة بسبب هويتهم الجنسية. فكل هاي الاشياء مع بعضها بتخلي يعني سوريا مكان غير آمن أبدا لأفراد مجتمع الميم.
أكتر شيء لفت لي نظري نحن وعم نعمل الاناليسز، بنعمل شيء اسمه ثيمز، بنقسم الانترفيوز اللي قدامنا كثيمز. كان في كتير ثيمز in common بين الثلاث بلدان، يعني ثيمز as discrimination, violence من أشخاص من السلطة. أوقات لازم هن يبينوا أشخاص، إذا عم نحكي عن الرجال هن لازم يكون عندهم manly figure بمحلات معينة ليقدروا يخفوا هويتهم قدام السلطات، أو مجتمعات معينة ممكن يكونوا من وراها عم ينأذوا أو عم يتعرضوا لعنف أو تهميش.
بيعانوا أفراد مجتمع الميم كتير من غياب أي بيئة آمنة لإلهم بسوريا. ما في جمعيات، ما في تجمعات، ما في قوانين بتدعمهم، ما في سبورت سيستم. الواحد كتير صعب يخلق السبورت سيستم اللي خاص فيه. لهيك كتير بيحسوا حالهم وحيدين. هيدا الشيء بيؤدي لأنهم عطول يكونوا عم يتظاهروا بهوية جنسية مختلفة عن ما هن عليه فعلا، لأنه بيلحقوا الصورة النمطية اللي بيخلقها المجتمع، لأنه الشاب هيك لازم يتصرف، هيك لازم يلبس، هيك لازم يعمل، وبيكونوا مش متصالحين مع حالهم. هذا الشيء بيعمل ضغط نفسي كتير كبير على أفراد مجتمع الميم.
أول ما جيت على تركيا مشيت بين المشاكل اللي شفتها إنه حتى كانوا المنظمات العلاج النفسي كانت بتآمن بإنه فينه البني آدم يقلب هويته الجنسية من gay لstraight.
The reason we wanted to do this research is that this is a subject that has been very much been at the margins or even completely invisibilized when we look at gender and conflict or gender and peace building, where there's been a lot of research on the impacts of war on women, often without looking at sexual orientation, to a lesser extent looking at impacts of war and conflict and displacement on men, again with much less of an focus also on sexual orientation, but then also other gender identities tend to be completely invisibilized, such as trans women, trans men, persons who are intersex and so on, who do not identify according to gender binaries. So we wanted to do this research and look at some of the particular vulnerabilities that persons of diverse SOGIES face in times of conflict and displacement.
في مرة نزلت نمت بالخيام لأنه ما كان عندي بيت، فكان هو المكان الوحيد اللي فيه عالم كان سيف إني يكون عم بقدر نام فيه بين عالم كنت بعرفهم لبنانية كانوا عم يعملوا سوا.
Of course, every situation is unique in many ways, but I think some of the findings that we have gotten out of this research will also be applicable to other contexts, which is that persons who are of diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions often face a whole variety of risks and vulnerabilities and violences that other civilians might not face to that extent.
من بعد الانفجار يعني وعيت لقيت بيتي كتير متضرر ومتأذي. حسيت بعدم الأمان، حسيت بأنه ليش أنا هون، ليش بده يرجع، ليش الحرب لحقتني من سوريا على لبنان. كان الشيء كتير صعب وكان شيء كتير مزعج بتحس بخيبة الأمل إنه أنت وين ما رحت حيكون على طول في حرب لاحقتك، حتكون حرب كتير كبيرة وأنت مش قادر تعمل شيء مقابلها.
الانفجار رجعني سنين لورا. الانفجار أكيد تعب لي كتير نفسيتي. ما بعرف، ما في إلا رجعت لحالة إدمان التفكير، إدمان الخوف.
انه قدرنا من خلال الفورماتيف ريبورت تبعنا تو كابتشر الامباكت اوف كوفيد-19 على مجتمع ميم عين، انفجار بيروت والوضع الاقتصادي الحالي يلي هو بمحل زاد الفولنربيليتيز اذا فينا نقول على مجتمع الميم عين. لهيك بخلال التصميم تبعنا بمرحله الريسيرش رح نكون عم نركز على هيدا الكومبوننت كمان، يعني رح نكون عم نركز على الكوفيد، رح نكون عم نركز على انفجار بيروت والوضع الاقتصادي، وبمحل رح يكون عم نركز على الاكيوميليشن of crisis على مجتمع الميم عين.
There were also some surprises for me at least, and I think one of the key takeaways for me from the research was to pay more attention to kind of some of the smaller or seemingly smaller issues that impact on the lives of our research participants. So a lot of our initial thinking, a lot of our initial questions were around the civil war itself, around displacement, around services to refugees, around transitional justice. But what was really striking in a lot of the interviews was how detrimental the effect of the everyday microaggressions are that our respondents face, the everyday racism, the everyday homophobia and transphobia, the everyday struggle for every little piece of their everyday life, and the cumulative effect that really has had on them in terms of their mental non-well-being and their sense of abandonment, frustration, depression, and so on. So I think that's maybe one of my key takeaways, is to also then pay more attention to those seemingly smaller issues which have a massive impact on people's lives.
الأذى الجسدي، فالجيش السوري أذاني، والعسكر اللبناني أذاني مرة، وأهلي أذوني مرات.
صعب لدرجة مو طبيعي. يعني هلا نحن وصلانين لمرحلة على أساس إنه فينك تسافر لأهلك أقل شيء يلي هن من الدرجة الأولى، بس هالحكي غلط. في منهم اضطروا يدفعوا رشوة لحتى يقدروا يسافروا. وإذا سافرت مثلا بطريقة بدون يعني إذن سفر، لازم عندك إذن سفر أو فيزا لنقول لحتى تقدر تسافر من مدينة لمدينة. إذا ما عندك إياها بتتغرم لدرجة مو طبيعية لسبب ما بعرف شو هو. بالنسبة لي شخصيا أنا كل ما أتعرف على حدا يعني برا غازيانتاب ممكن يكون كويس مثلا، لازم أشرح أنا إنه أنا كوني لاجئ سوري تحت الحماية المؤقتة ما فيني سافر لأسباب معينة ما بعرف شو هي. وأنا صلي يعني حاسس حالي أنا محبوس في غازيانتاب.
من وراء هالضغوطات كلها يمكن عن جد أنت ما تقبل حالك. أنا هلأ عن جد ماني عارفان حالي إذا بقبل حالي باسم فادي باسم دانا، ماني عارفان. يعني حدا بعيط لي هيك، حدا بعيط لي هيك، بطل عندي مشاعر.
للأسف الشديد عم بتمنى أترك لبنان وسوريا، أترك بلادي كرمال أقدر أعيش حريتي المطلقة. بتمنى أنه بيوم من الأيام أفراد مجتمع الميم يوصلوا لمرحلة ما يضطروا يتركوا بلدهم بس بسبب هويتهم الجنسية، لأنه هيدا شيء طبيعي، هيدا شيء ما اختاروه، وهيدا شيء لازم نتقبله كلنا.
Thank you all. Welcome back, Henry. Well, I'm glad it was like the last slide that you had in the presentation. And now we go directly for the first question from Neelam, actually a pack of questions about like the impact. What impact do contesting humanitarian needs in a fragile, conflict-affected state have on the availability of support/resources to the LGBTIQ plus community, and what could be done to prioritize this? The other one, what impact do these competing priorities have on any recovery from the pandemic? Henry?
Thanks. That's a very, very good question, and one that I think think about differently for different localities. So we did also do some interviews with international aid agencies, humanitarian aid agencies, UN agencies, and for the ones that are working inside Syria, the situation was quite different compared to those working in Lebanon. And Charbel, maybe you want to say something also about your work with agencies like the UNHCR. But what struck me in the interviews with those who are working inside Syria is that even though many actors were aware that there are issues, particular issues for LGBTI persons that need to be addressed, there was practically nothing that they were implementing, that it was seen as something that's too difficult, there's no information about it, there would be too much resistance within the agencies, too much resistance from the government, and so on. So there was kind of academic interest, so to say, from the UN agencies and INGOs, but very little happening on the ground. And I think I would say the situation is a bit different in Lebanon, where there is somewhat more of an awareness that there are particular needs of LGBTIQ refugees that need to be addressed. And I don't know, Charbel, if you want to jump in a bit with some of your experiences on this, because you've been also doing a lot of advocacy and training with some of these agencies.
Concerning the advocacy training, we tried, like in Mosaic, we try always to approach other organizations. We cannot exist in all over Lebanon, so we always try to do like a lot of SOGIE as training for international NGOs, local NGOs that are not really like as Nada mentioned, like if we have that on the car, but we trained a lot of the car NGOs on how to deal with, for example, survivor or sexual assault if they were like from the LGBTIQ community, or on SOGIE Ask, how to approach family with like SOGIE Ask or alternative sexuality, children, etc. So we do a lot of this work outside also Beirut. What was the other thing, Hani? Sorry, because I cannot check. You want me to elaborate on?
Or just some what your experiences have been like? How open have UN agencies been to working on these issues?
No, actually, yeah. Like I'll give an example with UNHCR. Like 4 years ago, actually, we had a lot of complaints from the LGBTIQ plus refugees in Lebanon about, like, you know, suffering from kind of homophobia or transphobia from the guards at UNHCR, or etc. And we really, they were very collaborative, and we talked to them, we raised a thing, and then we were training all their staff, starting from the, like, the guards up to the highest position in the UNHCR on SOGIE Ask, and the specificity to work with the LGBTIQ community, especially if they are refugees or they have they suffer, for example, from PTSD or etc. And they were very collaborative, and it was like until now actually we follow up on this, and we do kind of refreshers training for them.
Thanks, Shaka. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Yeah, well, maybe just add on sort of the competing priorities. I think that's going to be something that will be a huge question in upcoming years, not just for work on LGBTQI issues, but also on gender equality or social justice more generally. So our governments have been promising huge economic recovery packages to industries across the board, and at some point there will be a need to then also pay back some of these massive loans, for example, or raise taxes, and we have to be very careful and also be prepared to fight those struggles to ensure that money will not be taken away from gender equality work, from social justice work, from working on LGBTQI issues. But I think that's going to be something that we need to be very aware of in the upcoming years.
Cool. Nada, you wonder if we have any data or studies specific for the Bekaa area. Unfortunately, we don't have specifically for the Bekaa area, but we have a lot of data in Mosaic, not from this research, that most of our like social cases or like people who need security or legal help, most of them are from the Bekaa area, and through our referral system with other NGOs that we built over years, really we receive a lot of referrals from the Bekaa area, and maybe we can have a chat about it later about Bekaa. Well, any other questions? Good. Well, thank you a lot for your participation. And now, okay, I would like to invite you all for our next convention event about human rights and civil society dialogue in Sri Lanka tomorrow at 2:30 UK time. So thank you, Evelyn, for sharing the event link. Again, thank you all for your help, Becca, and all the NICA team, and all yours for all your support. And well, Henry, Caroline, you want to add anything?
Thank you all for participating and bearing with us. So glad to do so. Thank you.
Yep, just a word of thanks from me. It's great to see you all here, and thanks also to my team. And I was really, it was the first time I saw the documentaries, and they were really amazing.